All right, so let's get started. I'm sure there'll be more people filtering in here as we go, but it's 4:31, so let's get underway. My name is Brad Johnson. I'm the CEO of Sawyer Property Management, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the investment webinar series. Today we have Aaron Lindquist with Coastal Legal Counsel, who knows a whole lot about real estate investment from the legal side, and he's got a great presentation for everybody to help you know how to title your property, when and when not to use certain designations for your property, and a lot about how to find investment real estate, which is one of the hardest things out there when you're looking to invest. So, Aaron, I will let you take it away.
Right, thanks, Brad. And I'm going to share my screen here with you guys. And so, my name is Aaron Lindquist. I am a partner or the partner at Coastal Legal Counsel. I've been on my own for about 5 years now, and skip through here these couple of title slides for you guys. So I founded Coastal Legal Counsel in 2018. We don't do just real estate. So I do a lot of business law, so small business formation, general counsel type work, do a lot of estate planning and administration. So all of my practice areas end up kind of dovetailing at some point because I see real estate coming through estates. We see business interests at different points. We see businesses buying real estate. It's kind of everything I do ends up touching on the other practice areas. So I get a lot of overlap. And the fun fact about me is that I flipped my first property last year. So woohoo, on to the next one. So, and disclaimer, I am not a tax attorney. I know just enough to be dangerous. So talk to your CPAs, talk to your tax attorneys if you have them. I'm going to give you some basic information and knowledge, and please don't just take that and run with it, because I am not going to be responsible for those tax issues. So let's go ahead and jump into this. What we'll talk about today from an outline perspective, a couple of areas: finding and buying, ownership, and then exit strategies. So finding the properties, how we're going to finance them, how you want to hold title. On the ownership side, we'll talk about short-term rentals versus long-term, different types of leases, the eviction process based on your lease, and then exit strategies from 1031s and seller financing. Just as a quick note, I avoided any of the basics. Like you guys know, you can find properties in the MLS, so I wasn't even going to bother talking about that. You guys know you can just sell your property and be done with it. Also not going to talk about that. I want to talk about some of the things that are maybe a little bit different or that you may not have considered through this process. So I'm not going to talk about jumping on Zillow or using your local realtor on some of these things, because you guys probably already know how to do that. So on the finding and buying investments, that's always the question: is where can I find my next investment opportunity? And so, like I said, you guys know the basics. And so I'm looking at this from the legal side, and what I see a lot of is the different foreclosures that come out there. We obviously have everything from just a standard mortgage foreclosure from your bank. You have HOA foreclosures, which are always fun because it's like $900 in dues that somebody's getting foreclosed on. Then you have tax foreclosures. And you can find the foreclosure listings in a multitude of places, and we will talk about those, and I'll show you guys some screenshots of some different listings that are actually up right now in a couple different places. And so when we get to the foreclosure side, what everyone's probably familiar with is a standard mortgage. You've got a promissory note, a deed of trust, and somebody stops making payments. All of a sudden, after 90 days, their mortgage lender is going to start sending them nasty grams. Hey, if you don't pay this amount, we're going to institute a foreclosure. That gets the ball rolling on that process. It's a special proceeding. So if you guys aren't familiar with that, that means it's proceeding in front of the clerk of court, and it's a little bit different from your typical lawsuit. And so ultimately, that'll go through some hearings and can go to a public sale. If you've ever been to one, they're usually very anticlimactic. It's usually one lone person up there reading the notice of sale, which is just a very long monologue, pretty boring. And the fun starts happening when they start taking bids. And so that's usually done on the courthouse steps, and we'll talk about where you can find these listings. HOA foreclosures are a little bit different. If you end up living in a subdivision with an HOA, you've got those declarations. That's technically part of your loan agreement. If you go and look back at your mortgage, if you live in an HOA, you're going to have a rider attached to your deed of trust that's a PUD rider, meaning you've got to follow all your rules and regulations. Otherwise, it's a default under your loan as well. And that's because your HOA can foreclose your property, and your lender would not appreciate that because you decided not to pay dues because you're angry with your neighbor who's the HOA president. Same thing, it's a special proceeding. proceeds similarly to a normal foreclosure. Again, it's a public sale, similar process that way. And then you have tax foreclosures, which are really interesting because there's a few ways that those can be done. But most localities won't even start the proceedings for 3 years of back taxes. And at that point, how they proceed is different. There's a couple ways they can do it. Most typically, it's like a civil action. So they will end up basically filing an action to foreclose the property from their tax lien, and they serve everybody who's got interest. It can be a public or private sale. And so it's pretty interesting from that side of what will happen there. One issue, though, from tax foreclosures, depending on the way it's done, you might not be able to get title insurance. So if you're looking at a tax foreclosure, you need to find out whether it was done through a civil action or an in rem proceeding, because in rem proceedings typically are uninsurable, so you're not going to get title insurance. So that's one thing to know there with your tax foreclosure side of things. Finding foreclosure listings. If you've been doing this for a while, you may know, but government offices, the typical two, you can go to the special proceedings office at your local courthouse, go down to the New Hanover County Courthouse right here. They literally have a bulletin board with a listing of all the upcoming foreclosure sales, and you can take that information, plug it in, find out where that's at, what the property is. The tax office also will typically have a listing of their tax foreclosures up, similar to the courthouse's bulletin board. Online county tax office websites, because it's, you know, the 21st century, they'll have it listed there. And then actually law firm websites. There are, depending on the county, there's a couple of different lawyers that do a lot of the tax foreclosure work for the counties. And so you will see them run pretty robust websites, and I'll show you guys some examples there. And then the good old newspaper is still used for tax foreclosure listings that have to be published. So you can find them there occasionally in the legal section. So this is an example of a foreclosure listing. This is a county tax website for Duplin County. I pulled this last night just to make it as current as possible. And so you can see there's a couple of different properties that are going to be up for sale on this coming Thursday. And so you could go to Duplin County, pull the file number, find out what it is. Some of these are acreage, some of these may be a home. You know, some counties give you more information than others. And unfortunately, North Carolina is still very, very slowly moving into the 21st century. We just got e-filing in 4 counties last month, and eventually that will roll out across the state. So eventually anyone will be able to go online and look at foreclosure files, and you can kind of mine that public data for possible investment opportunities and things to bid on. And it'll be a lot easier than it is now. A lot of times now what you'll see is abstractors in there pulling and mining these files physically at the courthouse. So it'll be a lot simpler in just a few months to a couple of years, depending on your county. And then Hutchins Law Firm, if you don't know, Hutchins is probably the largest foreclosure site firm other than Brock and Scott in the area. And Hutchins has tons of foreclosures across the state. I refined this search just in New Hanover County. So right now you can see there are all of 3 foreclosures in New Hanover County. For all the craziness with rates and what's going on with banks and things right now, people are still, paying their mortgages. What I saw a lot as a residential real estate attorney was people not paying their mortgages because they had COVID deferrals, and then they had a guy that didn't pay for a year and still walked away, I think, with like 40 grand in his pocket. He just upped and sold and had a great deal on that side of things. So keep hearing that there will be foreclosures coming. We'll see. The market's a lot more sound than it was in 2008 from a lending and underwriting standpoint. So not a ton in New Hanover County, but there were quite a few across the state. So if you're investing all across North Carolina, check Hutchins' website, Brock and Scott. Most of these law firms that do these things will list them because they want to get these properties sold as well. And then another place you can find real estate investments is actually coming out of estates. And so in North Carolina, what's interesting is a real property is not part of the estate unless it's actually willed directly to the estate or to the personal representative. And so it seems a little bit counterintuitive and strange that way, but North Carolina likes to be different. And so the property passes directly to the heirs or beneficiary, basically at the time the person dies. That is the legal fiction. It passes at that time. And so those new heirs or beneficiaries can start selling the property, they can move into it, they can insure it, they can do whatever they want really at that point, with a couple caveats. In the estate world, they've got to actually probate or administer an estate just to clear up title. So you'll have North Carolina has creditor claims. And so if the creditors file enough claims, there's not enough assets in the estate, the attorney for the estate or the executor can pull the real estate back in to pay that. Well, the heirs can bypass that process by getting the executor to join in the sale. And so if they jump through all the hoops and formalities of opening the estate, the executor joins in the sale, all of a sudden they can sell the real estate and not have to worry about creditor claims. So estates can be a good way to find property because they have to be listed on all the estate applications. And so same thing, you can go down to the courthouse, mine that data from estate files and see what's out there. So finding estate property, online and print options, notice to creditors. Every estate has to publish that because it's, again, creditors have a right to file claims. And that's a 3-month time period. It's got to be published 4 times. So you at least have the opportunity to search online. If you actually read the newspaper, you can check your newspaper every week. You'll have new listings. You'll see the same listings for a 4-week time period. Obituaries are just a great opportunity for you to, hey, this person passed away. Let's plug their name into the tax office website and see what comes up. I've found some properties that I'm looking at right now that way. Saw a house and I was like, well, let's figure this out and check the obituaries, check the tax office website, and we're able to track down, who currently owns it now. Estate sale ads, you'll have estate sales that are being conducted out of these properties. We've got an estate now that the house is under contract. We'll end up having an estate sale. Unfortunately, this one was very well planned out, I will say, from an estate perspective. Most people aren't that well prepared. So here you'd be out of luck, but this is one where you could find the estate sale ads and see, okay, they're selling property out of this address. I wonder what's going to happen with the house. Just gives you, a warm lead on a potential property, especially as people are moving from the Northeast or from the other coast. They're moving here. Their families aren't here. What happens to the real estate? Do the kids want to own a house here? A lot of times they just want to sell it. They don't want to deal with the hassle. A lot of times we see partitions coming out of estates where 3 or 4 siblings end up receiving a property. They don't get along. Somebody wants to do short-term rentals, somebody wants to do long-term, and lo and behold, somebody files a partition to force the sale of the property. That's, kind of what'll happen sometimes. So I think estates are a good area to find property. Again, same thing, go to the county courthouse. The estate files are public records. So again, eventually in a couple of years, every single county will be online. You'll be able to just go and browse. Right now, you can go down there and take a look. COVID changed things a little bit. Before, you used to just be able to walk in there kind of freely and check files. Now they'll typically give you a handful for you to look at. So it's a little bit more difficult, but you can still check the state files. And then the tax office, if you plug in somebody's name or a property, drive by house, it looks, hey, no one's there. Plug in an address or a name, the listing may come up and show heirs of, John Smith. And so that means it's been an inherited property. They don't have a new owner listed yet because a will hasn't been probated or there was no will. So there's some cool ways to figure out, what property is out there and who owns it. And so now that you have maybe found your property, we got to figure out how we're going to finance it. Obviously you could pay cash. And so we're not going to talk about that side of things. That's the easy way to do this. But there's 3 types of lenders. If you guys are experienced investors, you may have used all of these. You may have, used some of them, maybe not all of them. You got your traditional lender. That's going to be your Wells Fargo, Bank of America, First Bank. They're going to have the most rigorous underwriting. They're going to require you to, put forth the most information, jump through all their hoops. And most of that's because they're subject to federal regulations for banking and mortgage lending. And they're going to be less likely as a result to lend on riskier investments. So they want to make sure it's a sure bet. They want, primary mortgages. They want, equity lines, refinances, a second home with a 20% down. They're going to be pretty by the book. In the middle, you've got private lenders, and that could literally be the guy down the street. And that's why I put it. We've got one client who works with a private lender, and, it's just a guy that met. And, I don't know what his underwriting process is, but I can guarantee you it is not nearly as strenuous as if you go to Wells Fargo or any of those places. So those private lenders are going to have whatever their own underwriting process is. It's going to be a lot more relationship based. they're going to have worked, hopefully, they'll take a chance, they'll work with you a few times, and, as they build some rapport, it becomes easier. They're much more likely to lend on non-traditional deals. So, I talked to a guy last week trying to find someone to broker, get some money for him. He wanted to buy a commercial residential space that had a potential for first floor commercial, and he was looking for somebody to lend on that. And so sent that out to my contacts and see what you could potentially find through that way. And a lot of times on the private side, you'll find bridge loans. We see this with a lot of the investors we work with. They'll come to closing, they'll have a gap shortfall of 45, 47 grand. So they'll get a quick $50,000 bridge loan that'll be 30 to 90 days. And it's usually just a flat, hey, I'm going to give you 50, you're going to pay me back 54, 58, something to that extent. And it's pretty easy, quick for those. And from what I've seen, they're typically better rates than hard money. I'm seeing a lot of the private lenders that are coming in under 10. Just that's been my experience. It may be different for you guys. So we've got some good contacts there. And then hard money, this is typically an institutional lender that's not your typical bank. The big one that kind of blew up over the last couple of years and one we work a lot with is Fund That Flip. They're out of Cleveland, and they've done a lot. We've also worked with Monroe Capital. They're up in New York. I've worked with those two lenders quite a bit with some of my clients. There's another one out of Charleston, South Carolina, that's just kind of starting up. They're a financial advisory firm, and they are starting to get into private lending, and it's Eagles Coast Capital Partners. So those are the three we tend to work with the most. Their underwriting, again, is going to be a little less rigorous, usually a lot better than the guy down the street, but not quite as bad as traditional bank. And again, it's because they're not subject to the same federal regulations. They're typically not doing primary mortgage lending, so they don't have to comply with TRID and a lot of these other consumer protection laws. And they're also, again, more likely to lend on non-traditional deals. This is going to be, fix and flips. We're going to buy and do construction on it. It's going to be raw land. You're going to do construction on a lot of different things of that. But they tend to be shorter term loans. They're typically going to be 12 months or less. Again, it's going to be, buy the property, build the house, sell it, and pay off the hard money loan at the end of the process. And they typically tend to be higher rates. We've seen most of them, like Fund That Flip right now, I think for some of our investors is coming in around 12.5%. Before interest rates started to rise, they were around 10. So just to give you an idea of where they're at. And so that's your typical lip lenders you're going to look at and find. Again, some of you guys are probably quite familiar with that. If you're not, that's some good information. The next step, we want to figure out how we're going to take title. And so this is just a random deed I pulled that I have no affiliation with either party on that one. And so, there's two ways really to hold title. Either you're going to hold it in your name or the name of multiple persons, or you're going to put it into an entity. There's pros and cons to each of these processes and different things like that. So again, it could be you and a spouse, you and multiple other owners. You guys could be in a partnership, in name only. You may be joint tenants. You may have inherited a property with some siblings like we were talking about earlier. Entities, obviously, you've got corporations, LLCs, actual partnerships where you file paperwork with the Secretary of State to register it. Or you may have trusts that are taking title to property. And so we'll talk through each of those. Owning in your personal name, it's usually the least complicated process. You throw your name down, you share your social security number if you need to for any reason, for banking, for lending. One of the big things that is helpful is called the step-up basis. If you guys do a lot of investing, you may have heard of that. But when you pass away, all of your property, real and personal, gets a step-up basis in tax value, meaning the fair market value in the property resets to what it would be as of your date of death, which is helpful for heirs, anyone receiving that property, because then they're taking title of that property at a new stepped up tax basis, and they're only paying on capital gains on the appreciation from date of death forward. So if you bought property in Wilmington, it for 50 grand 30 years ago, and it's now worth $1 million, you basically just passed off $950,000 in tax-free gains for them. So that step-up basis is automatic. All you have to do is die. Literally, that's it. The IRS tax code writes it in there. Asset protection only if you're married. In North Carolina, we have what's called a tenancy by the entirety, and it's a legal fiction that the marital unit owns the home. So if you have debts in one spouse's name, they won't attach to the property because, again, the law treats it as being the marital unit that owns the house. What does happen, though, is when you get divorced, one spouse dies. If the surviving spouse or the spouse taking the property ends up having judgments or something of that nature, those will then attach to the real estate. So it's not a lot of asset protection. And then since you don't have an entity, you don't have annual registration fees. You're not paying the Secretary of State to keep up an entity. You're also from the ease side of it, you're not filing corporate tax returns. You're not having to deal with that side of things. The cons of it, again, limited to no asset protection. It's in your name. So you get in a car accident and your insurance only covers a portion of it, and all of a sudden they're selling your investment property to help pay off this judgment from an automobile accident. That's the downside. There's also no privacy without an entity. Your name's on the tax listing. It's out in the public record. In this day and age, you can't always get out of there, but you can make it harder for people to figure out who owns the entity or what exactly you're doing out there in the real estate world. Entity ownership, again, the big pro on that is you get asset protection. You're creating a limited liability shield by moving that asset into a separate legal entity. Instead of it being in your name, it's now in this legal entity you've created. It also gives you some more privacy. You want to get really into it, you can create double blind LLCs in Wyoming or Florida to take ownership, so nobody knows who actually owns your LLC. Gets all kinds of silly. We have some clients that have done that for business purposes because they didn't want a competitor to know that they had bought the manufacturer. We see it in that realm. Some people just value the privacy aspect of it, so they want everything to be run through LLCs and mask their identity as much as they can, and that can be done with that entity there. The cons on that side, obviously, you've got additional tax filings. If you have a corporation, you may be having to file corporate returns. If you've got a partner, you're definitely going to have to file corporate returns. Then you have to issue K-1s. It just adds an extra layer there. And coming back to that step up in basis, for LLCs, do not get an automatic step up. They have to file a form with the IRS to ensure that step up comes through. So, there's some additional burdens there. And again, that's where you want to have a plan in place. From an estate perspective, how am I going to handle all of my real estate investments, as part of my estate when I pass away? Who am I passing that on to? And then again, if you have all these entities or multiple entities, you're going to start racking up annual registration fees. If you guys have an LLC, you got to pay the state of North Carolina $200 every year for the privilege of filing that one-page annual report, keeping it open. So that's the fun thing there. So a little more complex, a little more filings on the tax side for you, but you get a little bit more protection and privacy. Types of entities, most of you guys are probably familiar. Corporation, I would say in a given year, out of 100 entities I form, one is a corporation and one more is a nonprofit corporation. Most of what I form are LLCs. That's typical, a lot of what I see in the real estate world. Partnerships, don't see many of those, very rare. They do exist, and we'll talk about how those would work, and then trust as well. And trust will come through, and we'll talk about a little bit more from an estate planning or tax planning perspective can be helpful, just depending on where things are at. So the corporation versus the LLC, talking about what formalities, taxation, and again, registration fees. So corporations require more formalities. You've got to have a board of directors. I was looking actually at the statute today, talking to a client. The board has got to be one or more persons. So, I mean, you got at least yourself on that board. You have to jump through more hoops as far as annual meetings, making sure things are voted on, properly documented. LLCs, again, no board needed. If you're the sole member, you're the sole member. You can basically just act. If you're borrowing money, some places are going to have stock resolutions that you would need to sign, on behalf of the LLC to document that, hey, the LLC is voted on and approved taking out this debt, things like that. But that would be standard for any kind of entity that's borrowing money. The side of corporations, the downside is it's double taxation. So the standard corporation, a C corp, is taxed at the entity level on all of its earnings, and then when it kicks out, money to the owners, that's taxed again. So you end up with that double taxation, which is usually the negative. So corporations, again, tend to be less used for that reason. The good news is their annual registration fee is all $25, so it's pretty simple, pretty cheap to keep those going every year. And then again, on the LLC side, you avoid the double taxation. There's no tax at the LLC entity level. But they have what's called pass-through taxation. And so pass-through taxation is just that, the taxes pass through the entity to you, the owner or owners. Again, if you have partners, multiple persons, you're going to have to end up filing that. It was typically an informational corporate return for the LLC, since there's no corporate tax. And that's what issues your K1, which is, this has been my, disbursements. This is what I'm going to pay taxes on for this year from this entity. And again, you've got that $200 a year annual registration fee. And if you don't pay that for a couple of years, they'll administratively dissolve your LLC. And then you've got to pay like all of the back year's annual taxes plus some late fees. I had one client one year we had to reinstate. It was like $750 to reinstate the LLC. So if you guys have entities, make sure you are on top of annual reports every year. You don't want them to get dissolved. That can have negative consequences for you guys, from corporate actions that are taken when the LLC is dissolved to tax implications as well. So make sure you file those annual reports, and actually due April 15th. So you guys got about a month. So make sure you get on those if you haven't filed them yet. S corp election. So talking about corporations, a lot of you guys have probably heard about S corps if you have had any kind of entity. They're popular because it's, again, pass-through taxation. The downside with S corp election is it is horrible for real estate. You really do not want to do an S corp election. It prevents you from getting the step-up basis whatsoever. So if you have an S corp owning real estate and you buy that house at $250,000, you own it for 40 years, and all of a sudden it's $1.5 million, whoever inherits it is paying capital gains on all of that appreciation. So that alone is usually the reason not to go with an S corp. There are a couple other reasons. You can talk to your accountants, your tax lawyers on the real fine points. But the big one is it eliminates that step up in basis. So you are passing on a lot of capital gains by doing that. And it does not make sense in the long run to have real estate in an S corp. So if you hear anybody tell you, oh yeah, start an LLC and make it an S corp, don't do it. If you're going to own real estate in it, don't do that. The benefits of S corps are that you can pay yourself a salary. You can avoid some of that self-employment tax, which is great. But again, it's not usually worth it in the long run if you're owning real estate in that S corp. So, and the S corp is just actually a tax election. It's not an entity itself. So you can be an LLC with an S corp election. Like, actually, that's what my law firm is. I'm a professional LLC with an S corp election. So I can deduct my salary. I don't have to pay as much self-employment tax. So there's value to it, just not in the owning real estate assets world. So again, talk to tax lawyers. When you're forming LLCs, or when you're going to buy anything, you want to talk to people that are going to know how to properly set that up, so you don't end up with a bad tax situation down the line. The next step is partnerships. And so partnerships are simply two or more persons carrying on business for profit. And in North Carolina, if you look at almost any statute, a person is defined as an actual individual, or it can be a corporate entity. So you could have two LLCs that go in and say, hey, we're going to form a partnership and we're going to invest in real estate, doing that. You could do that. There's general partnerships, there's limited liability partnerships, the whole host of those. I'm not going to go through each of them. Most people I know don't actually end up forming partnerships. Most people just go through and form a multi-member LLC and do their investing that way. There can be reasons for doing the partnership, for sure. We've got investor clients right now that we're working on an operating agreement with them for a general partnership, limited partner investments for bigger things like big box storage units or car washes or things of that nature. And so there can be benefits to them, especially if you're looking for financing, raising capital for bigger investments outside of just residential properties. Again, additional tax filings, you have to file partnership tax returns, jump through all those hoops. So it can be beneficial depending on what you're doing. Probably not what you're going to want if you're looking at, building a portfolio of short-term rentals or single-family homes, however you're doing that. And then looking at the trust side of things, there are two kinds of trust. You've got revocable and irrevocable. And again, this could be part of your planning. Revocable is kind of what the name sounds like. You can revoke it or amend it anytime you want. It does have some limited creditor protection, and I mean very limited. And it's kind of dubious as to whether that even really exists. I've seen this from the legal side where I've tried to enforce a judgment. So we had a judgment against a property that a woman had put into a revocable trust. And so our argument was that in North Carolina, it says you can get to the assets of the trust. So we said, hey, our judgment attaches and we've got a lien ahead of the mortgage on this property. And so we were able to work out a deal and get that resolved before we got an answer from the court, whether that limited creditor protection actually exists or not. But I think there is some limited creditor protection. It at least makes it harder for people to get to the asset, because if they've got a judgment against John Smith, well, that's a judgment against John Smith, not John Smith, the trustee. So it makes them jump through some extra hoops and work for it to actually get after the property. And again, we want to protect the assets you've built up. And so it can be a way to protect it a little bit. And the good thing about revocable trust is there are no tax implications. Department of Revenue, the IRS, they look at a revocable trust and say that's just you. It's an estate planning tool. That's where you're using it for. We're not going to treat it any differently. You don't file any different type of tax returns if you have a revocable trust. It just is really changing the title of assets on paper so that you can better plan for succession planning for estates, investments, all those kinds of things. Again, it's more of an estate planning tool. Irrevocable trusts, on the other hand, are just that. They cannot generally be amended or revoked. There are ways to do it, but it's very difficult. There's a lot more creditor protection because it is its own legal entity. When you create an irrevocable trust, you go and get a tax ID number for it. It's basically its own business out there. It may have to file tax returns if it generates income. And that's the downside of the tax implications. The trust tax code gets to the top bracket very quickly. After, I think this year it's $12,500 or $13,000 in income. All of a sudden you're at the tax bracket. So irrevocable trusts owning income generating property, not always a great idea. Can be if you're very high net worth, because what you're going to want to do is move the estate, you're wanting to move assets out of your name. And so irrevocable trust can be great for that while you're alive. There's a whole host of different kinds of trusts. Big one that we see is qualified personal residence trust, or QPERTs. And those allow you to put your primary or even a secondary investment property in them. And if you outlive the initial trust term, then it's no longer considered part of your estate. So that removes it. So if you're high net worth individual with a lot of highly appreciated property, you can move stuff out of your estate to reduce your taxable burden. So there's a good reason to use them. We'll have people use them as well for if they have children with disabilities, putting real estate into a special needs trust, less so on investment side, but reasons they can be used. So what else is kind of cool though, is you could actually layer these up. So if you've got your LLC, you've got that creditor protection, you've got a layer of protection there. You could actually then have your trust, your revocable trust, own your LLC membership interest. So then you've got some extra couple of layers separating you from it, and some better estate planning practices there as well. So you can kind of add an extra layer. And so that's always a fun one as we look at planning for clients who have portfolios and multiple properties. We'll talk about, hey, let's make sure they're all in entities and then have the trust own them. And then let's say you bought, this is your first rental property, or maybe third or fourth. You've got loans on almost all of them probably, and they're in your personal name because the bank's not going to lend to you with, 123 Easy Street LLC. They're just not, they don't like to typically. That's another issue you'll find. Banks are less likely to lend to these little LLCs that you would want to hold your property in. And so if you've already purchased it, you can transfer it to an entity. I have clients do this with some regularity. What I always tell them is beware that the due on sale clause in your mortgage could potentially be triggered. So long as you and your spouse, if you're on the deed, own the LLC, it's very unlikely that that would trigger it because you have what they call the beneficial interest in the property. But it's one thing I tell clients, look, if the bank comes back and says, hey, you transfer this without our authority, be prepared to either transfer it back or pony up, all of the note that's due and owing at that point. It's rare, but it does happen sometimes. If you transfer ownership from your name to the LLC, your mortgage is probably escrowing insurance proceeds, like insurance payments. So you're going to want to update that so that the additional named insured is now the LLC as well, or that the LLC has its own policy. And then timing, you're going to want to establish like payment history with the mortgage company. Make half of a year's worth of payments in your name, then deed it over. And I will tell you, most of the time, as long as the payments keep coming in, the lenders don't care. To be honest, I mean, sometimes they do, but for the most part, as long as payments keep coming in, they're happy. And then if you're working with a property management group, you're handling it yourself, whatever you're doing, update your lease agreement. You want to have a valid lease. So if that tenant that's in there needs to be evicted, you've got a valid written lease. The last thing you'd want to do is go into that and all of a sudden your lease is you individually and the tenant, and all of a sudden you don't have any grounds to evict this person. So that would be a bad scenario. So just some things to be aware of if you do transfer it. But again, we do that pretty regularly, going from an individual who's closed on it, and then a year later we deed it over to their LLC or the new LLC we've created. So owning your investment. So what are you going to do now that you've bought it? So this is where we're going to talk about what kind of rental. Are we looking at short term, which in North Carolina is typically anything 30 days or less. So it could be seasonal rentals, VRBO, Airbnb, massively popular. I know in Wilmington, I want to say it was like a 40% increase after our courts struck down New Hanover County's ban on short-term, or not the ban, all the registration and proximity requirements on short-term rentals. After that, it was like a massive uptick in short-term rentals across New Hanover County. So you see a lot of those. It could be corporate rentals. I know people that have rentals that are just geared toward working with healthcare facilities. So they rent their units to travel nurses or something like that. Could be short-term stays. Could be a little bit longer, may qualify for a long-term rental. And again, that's going to be anything over 30 days for long-term. This is going to be your traditional residential leases, your off-season snowbirds who want to come down to rent for 4 months to get away from New Jersey winters, wherever they may be up north. So that's what you'll see there. And then buyer beware, perform your due diligence. I'm actually looking at a property right now with one of the realtors I work with. And we were talking today about the declarations for this unit. It's in an association, and that's what we're looking at. Could we get this as a short-term rental under the current rules, the HOA declaration? Some HOAs when they were formed 25, 30 years ago had no idea, no one could have predicted Airbnb or VRBO. They didn't really have short-term rentals in that sense, other than going through a property management or beach rentals or something like that. So a lot of them did not have prohibitions on short-term rentals. And so you're seeing that become a hot button issue in the HOA world right now. That's typically coming across the listservs I'm on with some frequency. So check the HOA documents. There can be restrictions if there's not an HOA. So, a lot of times what I've seen, like in my parents' neighborhood, one guy owned all of this acreage, and anytime he wants to make some money, he just subdivides off a couple acres and sells it. Well, he put restrictions across the entire parcel, before he started selling them off. And so some of those prevent like ADUs. So you can't have an accessory dwelling unit or a granny flat that you could use for Airbnb on any of those properties. So there's no HOA, but any resident could enforce it. And so, you may have restrictions that would prevent that. From a practical standpoint, I tell clients, like that neighborhood has some accessory dwelling units. I don't think anyone enforces those restrictions, but they are there. You're going to have to disclose them to get title insurance. So, you can take that calculated risk of, do we build it and hope nobody says anything? And some people do, but you just have to be aware you're taking that risk. And then local rules and regulations, zoning, permitting. Like I said, New Hanover County used to have that short-term rental cap in proximity. You couldn't have so many within proximity to each other. So you just want to make sure, like, what do I want to use this for, and can I use it for that purpose? Because you could find what you think is a great deal, and all of a sudden you can't actually use it for short-term rentals. It could be a problem. So you want to look through that side of things. Types of leases. Now that we've decided, you've got a residential rental agreement. North Carolina has a statute specifically for that. Vacation rentals has its own statute, and they are similar but quite different. Residential rental agreements can be oral or written. So if you're working with a property management group like Sawyer, you're not going to have an oral lease, and I recommend that you don't have an oral lease. Like, write it on a cocktail napkin if you have to, but like, please have a written lease agreement. I can't tell you how many times we've gone to evict somebody, and landlord says the oral lease is one thing, tenant says the oral lease is another, and what do we do? Where he said, she said. So you want to have a written lease agreement. The big thing, either vacation rentals or residential rentals, you're going to have a real estate trust account, and that's going to be for your security deposit. For your typical long-term leases, that's got to be in there. You've got to have that segregated. It's a consumer protection statute. If you don't do that, the North Carolina statutes say you can't keep that security deposit. So if you violate the security deposit laws, you have to give it back to the tenant, even if they've damaged your unit. So make sure you're complying with those requirements. And that's why it's good to work with somebody who knows what they're doing. You've got property management companies that are holding those in trust accounts and establishing those and having those there for you. And the good thing too about having the written lease is you can put stuff in there about the court filing fees, attorney's fees. And in North Carolina, it can actually be pretty generous on the fees that you can recoup if you've got to file some litigation. You can get certain enumerated fees for filing a complaint if they appeal. You can also get your actual attorney's fees. It's kind of buried in the statute, but we routinely get that when we go through and file evictions. So we get the whole host of authorized statute fees by statute, and then the attorney's fees at the end. And then if you want a written lease, there is a standard form one. A lot of times that is kind of the way to start and go. Just like there's a standard form offer to purchase and contract, there are standard form residential rental agreements and vacation rental agreements. So on the vacation rental side, just to note, none of those can be oral. They have to be in writing by North Carolina law. And fun thing is you can actually include your admin and cleaning fees as part of your rental in there for vacation rentals, which is one thing that is not in the residential statute. Same thing, you've got to have that trust account. And it's a little more strict on vacation rentals. So if you've got strict rules on advancing rent, so you've got a VRBO, somebody rents and they pay everything up front. Well, North Carolina says you've got some of that's advanced rent, some of that might be security deposit, some of those are fees. They've got a 50% rule that you can't advance more than half of that, until they've actually stayed at the property. So that's one thing to be concerned about. And then there's third-party expenses. So if you're paying somebody to handling a vendor or something, you can actually pay them out of those funds. So there are some exceptions to it. But it's consumer protection, and North Carolina law is pretty unforgiving. It says, look, if you don't comply with this, guess what? You forfeit that money. It's got to go back to the tenant. And so you want to make sure you guys are adhering to that, because you don't want to do all that work and not get paid. Same thing, court and attorney's fees. And then again, that standard form is in there, and that's why you want to have that in place. I've talked to some people who have bought investment properties and they're doing it through VRBO or anything like that. We generate and have generated specific forms for clients. So I know a lot of times they can book through these websites. And a lot of times what we're now seeing and recommending is that, hey, you book through the website, but it's not official until you have signed and returned our lease agreement, because you want to have that in there. Again, North Carolina law is requiring it. So we want to dot I's, cross T's. And so we typically always recommend having that vacation rental lease agreement, not just relying on the terms of service and agreement through any of these booking websites themselves. And then eviction, which is not what anyone ever wants to deal with, but is a reality of typically long-term rentals. I have not seen too many short-term evictions, but there is specific procedures for that. Both instances, there are small claims action. So you file it, you're in front of the magistrate, very informal. In New Hanover County, actually, you're basically just sitting at everybody's sitting at a desk talking to the magistrate. Very, very informal procedure. So the long term, again, it's got to be a lease greater than 30 days. And then, or unless you're renting a room, you can have like a week-to-week rental in that instance. But typically, if it's a long-term residential rental, once they're in default for not having paid, or they're violating a non-monetary obligation, like they're consistently having police called on them, noise issues, something like that, you pretty much will have a hearing within 2 weeks of filing it. So it's pretty quick. For that reason, they want landlords to be able to retake possession of the property. And if you get a judgment that day and there's no appeal, you're typically about 3 weeks out from retaking possession. There's some deadlines in there. So I tell clients you're 30 to 60 days, depending on timeline, from getting it back. One thing to be aware is that like tenants can appeal. It's a matter of right, but they've got to jump through some hoops usually. So they would have to post a bond. If rent comes due from the time they appeal, they've got to pay that into the court. So at least the court's collecting your rent for you. If they don't do those things, then their appeal is like dismissed, and you can get them out and send the sheriff out to take them, retake possession. So there's a whole host there. We do evictions. I've represented landlords and tenants on both sides. If any of you guys had tenants during COVID, I'm sorry. I know that was a crazy time. I represented landlords and tenants and used all the COVID stuff as a sword and a shield. And it was a crazy time there with all those deferrals and eviction moratoriums. So short-term evictions, again, small claims action. Again, your lease is less than 30 days. It's typically a vacation rental. What's cool about this is the hearing is in like 12 to 48 hours. It can't be any farther out than that. So you're going to have your hearing in 1 to 2 days, and they can put you in possession within 2 to 8 hours. So it's geared for immediacy. So ideally, you're out like 3 days of bookings if you can get them out. And what's interesting here is on the appeal, if the tenant wants to appeal, they may potentially be on the hook for like paying all of your rent. So if you have another tenant coming in saying it's a beach house and it's $10,000 for the week, and like we're gonna eat into that, they may have to post a $10,000 bond or pay 10 grand cash into the clerk of court in order to stay in the appeal and not be booted. So there's some good teeth and enforcement mechanisms on those. And so again, you can file a lot of these yourselves. They are pre-printed forms of the clerk of court. If you don't live in the area or you don't want to handle it, we do them. I don't know a ton of attorneys who do, and I'm not just saying that. Like I think I have like one other attorney I refer them to if we don't take them, because there was a brief period there where I didn't do evictions for a while. There's just not a ton of attorneys. We do them, and you can go down and do them yourself. They're pretty informal. And we also will just consult with landlords. Hey, here's what the process looks like. Here's what you need to do. And most of the time you can accomplish it, on your own. Exit strategies. So we bought it, we owned it. Now I don't want to own it any longer. So what is that going to look like? And so from that perspective, obviously you guys can just sell it. So I'm not going to even really jump into talking through that side of it. On the real estate side, these are the potential taxes you're going to face when you sell a property. So, I mean, you're looking at if you've depreciated it over a long period of years, and, typically the IRS allows you to depreciate it for about 27 and a half years. There are some accelerated depreciation schedules you can use. So 25% of all that depreciation gets recaptured when you sell it. You're going to pay capital gains depending on how long you've owned it at one of those two rates. You're potentially going to pay that Medicare, that federal tax there, and then North Carolina state income tax. So you're looking at quite a bit of taxation when you go to sell a property, especially if it's highly appreciated. And so 1031 exchanges are a great way to avoid those taxes. So you've got the 1031 exchange. You sell real estate investments, tax authorities want their money. This allows you to avoid the tax man. And what happens is you hire a company to serve as a qualified intermediary. When you close on the property at the sale, you wire the money to the intermediary, they hold it. You find a replacement property, which is called like kind. And that simply means you find another piece of real estate. You've got to sell a piece of real estate and add another piece or multiple pieces. You could sell a commercial building and buy raw land. You could sell a single family home and buy quadplexes. You're basically just replacing real estate with real estate. There is a timeline to do it though. You got to ID your properties in 45 days and close within 180. So there's some good options there. The big thing from a planning perspective though is if you do this right and you just like 1031 exchange every property you ever sold and then you die, you basically would never have paid capital gains on any of that, and your heirs would inherit the property with all that appreciation. So, I mean, if you play your cards right, you never pay the capital gains tax on it, and it's a great tool for planning perspectives. There's a couple of seller financing options, and I'm just looking at my watch on timing for you guys. I want to get you guys some questions. You can do owner financing. Most familiar option, you draft a note, you have a deed of trust. Pretty standard, like a normal lender situation. There's a lease option where you have a normal landlord-tenant relationship. Your tenant can choose to buy the property if they want, but they don't have to. They're going to pay an option fee that's non-refundable, but you're going to retain title. And if they don't exercise the option, then it's forfeited, or it'll automatically expire at some point. And then a typical or atypical one is a contract for deed. This is where you basically, you do that. You enter into a written contract saying the potential buyer is going to pay you X amount of dollars per month for however many months until they've paid you the purchase price. And when that's done, the last payment, you turn around and deed the property to them. They're really complex from a consumer protection standpoint. And I tell clients, you don't want to do them. You might as well just do a seller financing situation because it's easier. The seller financing, you just foreclose, you're done with it, you get your property back. Contract for deeds require you to jump through a lot of hoops in order to forfeit that contract. So that's all I've got today, guys. So I'm happy to answer questions with whatever time we've got left. And my contact info will also be on here as well. So what have we got, if anything?
Yes, I've got a bunch.
Cool.
All right, so a couple questions about passing properties down. So I know you talked a little bit about the trust and the revocable and irrevocable, but what do you sort of recommend for the best way for parents and grandparents to pass properties down to children to avoid taxes and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, just die owning it. Like seriously, you get the step up basis. If you own it in your own name, like when you die, the fair market value resets, and then so your heirs inherit it. You know, especially if your grandparents, like that generation. I know older generations bought houses and lived in them like their whole lives. Like my best friend's parents still live in the house they bought in like the 80s. You know, they've been there 40 plus years. So I mean, if they were to go and sell that today, they would pay. I mean, they'd have some exemption because it's a primary residence, but there's some potential massive capital gains. So inherit it. Don't deed it ahead of time. Let your family inherit it.
Don't overcomplicate it. Got it. Another question here. The understanding that you are not a CPA and that people should
yes
go to CPAs for tax questions, but what are some tax benefits of long-term rentals versus short-term vacation Airbnb? What are the sort of the implications of that?
I mean, on that side, on the top of my head, I don't know any in that particular realm because you can depreciate the real estate in either scenario.
Okay.
You know, I don't know that there's a huge difference. And that's just, you know, my working knowledge of tax doesn't know that side of it well enough to know if there is a difference. And again, that's a great question for CPA because from my side of things, I'm thinking, okay, depreciation's still there. You're still going to pay income tax. You're still going to have all of those. You know, if you have improvements to the property, whether it's short or long term, I don't know. I would send that. I'd punt that to the CPA.
Yeah. Okay. And when you have a number of rental properties, well, let me ask it in a different way. Does the number of properties that you have, does that make a difference and make more sense to put things under an LLC? And if so, grouping them under one LLC versus registering them to each one of them to a different LLC. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so I've seen a whole host of things, and a lot of times what we'll recommend, if you have enough properties, you don't, again, you want the limited liability protection. So if the more properties you put under one entity umbrella, the more liability exposure there is, because there's more assets there for somebody to go after if they get a judgment against the property or the entity. So we typically will tell clients, like, create a real estate holding company. If you're wanting to own a bunch of properties, create a holding company, and then create smaller entities, like chunk them, like put 5, whatever is a good number in your mind in separate LLCs. Again, you're separating out liability. And then because the owner of the sub LLCs is just the holding company, all the revenue, all of the taxes, all that stuff just flows right back up to the holding company. So eventually you have the holding company owning, reporting all the income, getting to write off the expenses and all that kind of stuff. So I would do a holding company with smaller sub LLCs.
Okay, and further separating yourself and your personal interests from liability related to your rental properties.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Let's see. How long does it take typically to change the deed to reflect the change to the LLC? Like, how long does it take to work with the attorney to do it? How long does it take for it to show up on the title search? What is the timing like?
Typically on our end, we can generate a deed, literally in a matter of minutes. So, like, if we meet with the client, as long as we have a copy of the prior deed, which, we can pull that from the registry if the clients don't have it. Typically we can turn around a deed and record it within a day. It just depends on how busy we are. The actual deed generation and then recording isn't instantaneous, but pretty quick. With e-recording these days, we can record across the entire state of North Carolina. In most of those places, within 20 to 30 minutes of us submitting it, it's on the record, it's in the chain of title. And so we've had clients come in the morning and we have a new deeded interest in the afternoon.
Okay.
Yep.
You don't have to take your bicycle down to the courthouse anymore.
No, thankfully not. I do hand record stuff very occasionally if it's like, I'm going to save $10 on each of these documents or something like that, but it's really rare.
Yeah, I bet. Okay, cool. Well, I appreciate it. And that concludes the 5 or 6 Q&A questions that we received. So thank you, Aaron, for your time. Do you have your slide that has your contact information?
Yep. So there's my contact info for you guys. It's out there. You can reach me. I'm right in the Lumina station, so I am pretty easy to find, close to the beach. You can visit our website. If you want to meet with me, you can go and schedule online on our website. You can call us and schedule whatever. So we do a whole host of things. So thank you guys to Sawyer for letting me present. I appreciate it. Brad, thanks. And thank you guys for attending.
Absolutely. And we did record the webinar, so we will send this out to everyone so that you have a link if you want to watch it again, because there was something that you wanted to see, or if you know someone who might be interested, just pass it along. We'd love that. All right. Thanks a lot, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
All right. You too. Bye.